How simple or how complicated does something have to be for us to feel comfortable with it? Now, that may seem like a bit of an odd question because I think we all tend to think of simple as better. We don't want things to be overly complicated. We want them to be simple. Or do we? Now, I think complexity is somewhat in the eye of the beholder. What may seem complicated to one person may not seem or be as complicated to another person. The simple things, though, I think are easier for us to identify and easier for us to define than the complex sometimes. And rather than talk about complexity itself, what I thought I would do is talk about what complexity does to us, what it can do for us, and how we deal with it. In a previous talk, I discussed some of the practices on our prescribed fire operations that we've done over the years, and some of the things that we don't do any longer or we do less of, and why we don't do them anymore. One of the things that I brought up was putting in hose lays and use of water, and a lot of those hose lays were put in to support hand lines snaking off through the woods somewhere. Now, hand lines are a necessity sometimes, but they're also a complication, and they're something that makes our life, our fire life, if you will, harder, because hand lines are harder to hold. They are not as secure as a dozer line or another wider line. They're not as accessible to equipment, obviously. All these are why we ended up putting hose lays down these hand lines to help secure them or help hold them as we burned off of them. Now, what I talked about before was not using these hand lines as much anymore and not using the hose lays to support them. And why is that? Well, a lot of it was because we started to redraw up burn unit boundaries and essentially eliminate these hand lines from the burns themselves. We went back to a bigger unit with wider lines. We started to use natural barriers where we could. We started to use roads, and where we couldn't do that and where we could improve where those lines were, then we started widening them out, either mechanically or with some hard work by hand, manually, to make them more accessible, to make them wider, and make them more secure. So what we did essentially was make them less complicated by either eliminating them entirely or converting them into something more secure and more easily held and worked with. So effectively, we made things easier on ourselves by making them less complicated. One should always remember that simple isn't necessarily always going to be the best answer or the right answer. So that whole water handling issue, be it hose lays or pump stations or any of that, that can be a complicated issue or a complicated subject. And a lot of times we make it more complicated than it needs to be. If you take the pumps class, the S211 class, you may see charts and graphs and slide rules about friction loss and how much water a section of 1.5-inch hose holds, and so on and so forth. And the objective of all of that is essentially what a mentor of mine told me many years ago after I came back from the 211 class, from taking the 211 class, and was picking his brain because he had a lot of experience had knowledge of water handling. So I started, bugging him with all this stuff about friction loss and, how far a pump could pump and, a particular pump. And he basically said, look, you set your pump up, you do your hose lay, you turn it on, and if you have water coming out the other end, that's all you need to know. Again, that may be a bit of an oversimplification, but I have really found that to be the case. I remember on a fire, I think it was in Idaho or Montana, a number of years ago that I was on, and we were essentially spiked out with a couple crews doing mop up a ridgeline, up on top of a ridgeline, and we were doing some bucket drops, some helicopter work on these spots. But that gets kind of expensive, and there's always a demand for those aerial resources. So we're kind of sitting around the division soups, and we had all this hose and implements laying around, and someone got the bright idea, and it was not me, to shove hose up this ridge the whole way to the top. And did we need to do it? No, really. But we had the time, we had the labor, and it almost became a challenge to see if we could do it. Going back to that first question I asked about how simple or how complicated does something have to be for us to feel comfortable with it, I think sometimes we need a certain level or degree of complication to feel better about things. As an example, I would look at engines. Now, I have worked on engines my entire career, or worked around them, and some have been better than others. Some have more capacity, more capability. Some are better equipped, newer, older. But I have always felt like I wanted to have the best equipment that I could. Always have the newest, the most capable piece of equipment. That gave me confidence in working on that piece of equipment and what I could do with it. Now, oftentimes that meant a more complicated piece of equipment. But really, the basic function is the same. You have a tank full of water, and you're flowing water from that engine onto the fire. Whether it's new, old, fancy, primitive, it all sort of comes back to the same basic function. And the light kind of went off for me a number of years ago when I went through the Prescribed Fire Training Center, and the module that I was with was assigned to Avon Park Air Force Bombing Range. And we rode into the yard the first day and looked at what the Air Force civilian personnel that were conducting the burning on the base had for engines. And what they had was a surplus military pickup truck, still with the green camouflage paint, with a plastic ag tank in the bed, plumbed into a portable pump with some hose, and that was their engine. And they also had a military deuce and a half set up in a similar fashion with just a tank and a portable pump and some hose. And like I said, the light kind of went off for me because we went out that week with the Air Force guys and burned 6,000 or 8,000 acres without incident. And we didn't need all that fancy equipment that I had previously thought we needed to get the job done. However, looking at the other side of the coin, I was not terribly comfortable or confident when I saw that setup that the Air Force was using compared to what I'd used in the past, the Type 6 engines that I'd worked on in the past. I felt more comfortable, more confident with that better, more complicated, more complex piece of equipment. Now, that feeling is very important. That confidence you have is very important, but it doesn't necessarily have to come from the equipment you're using. So I look at how we deal with complexity, and I look at it kind of in three stages or three levels, if you will. And a lot of it is based on experience, but I look at that first level, that early level, where we don't have a lot of experience, we don't have a lot of knowledge, just by virtue of our lack of entry into fire operations. And by default, almost, we have to keep things simple. We cannot deal with complicated operations or complicated subjects just because we don't know anything. We are therefore uncomfortable with more complex scenarios. We're uncomfortable with more complex situations. We don't have as much confidence in dealing with them. Now, that doesn't mean that in that early stage we can't get ourselves or find ourselves in some rather complicated situations, but how we deal with them is entirely different as we gain experience and gain knowledge. And that is to me kind of the second stage of us dealing with complexity, and that is a stage where, or a level where, we've gained experience, we've gained knowledge, we've had training, we've seen things and we've done things, and now we're more capable of dealing with complex issues or complex subjects. We feel more comfortable with them. We feel more confident in dealing with them. That also means that we can now begin to create some complexity on our own rather than just being handed a fire situation. And that can be good or bad. Sometimes that extra experience and knowledge can get us into trouble by us overreaching, overextending ourselves. So you have to be cognizant of that overconfidence that now comes at that stage. And finally, the third stage I see is when we are well experienced and we have a great deal of knowledge to draw on, and we're comfortable handling complex situations. And I think in some ways, at that point, it starts to loop back around to that early stage, because with that experience and with that knowledge and with that comfortableness handling complex situations, I think we try in a lot of ways to simplify those complex situations to the most we can, and only complicate things as necessary, as they're needed. And I think that is kind of the full circle of our dealing with complexity. So be aware of where you are on that complexity scale, and keep checking yourself. Make sure that you're dealing with the complexity at an appropriate level, and keep in mind that you or your employees or your fellow firefighters might need that extra little bit of complexity, even if you don't, even if you're at that experience stage and you're trying to simplify. Don't go overboard, and leave a little bit of room there to build confidence and make folks comfortable with the operations that they're doing.